The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the sprawling countryside. It was the kind of peaceful evening that made you believe the world had forgotten its troubles. For Emily and Jake, it was the perfect setting for a new chapter in their lives. After years of the bustling and noise-filled city life, they had found something more quiet, more secluded, a place to build a future. A house. But this was no ordinary house. Tucked deep in the heart of the countryside, surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills, the house stood like a forgotten relic of the past. Its stone walls, now veiled by the encroaching vines and ivy, gave it an ancient, almost haunted appearance. The windows, once bright with life, were now clouded with the years, their glass cracked or entirely missing. The front door, a heavy wooden slab with peeling paint, creaked in the wind as if mourning its abandonment. It was the kind of house that seemed to have stories written into every crack and crevice. Yet no one had come to read them in years. Emily stood at the property, gazing up at the house, the crisp evening air pulling her dark hair behind her like a ghost. She wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, at least not seriously. Skeptical by nature, she'd always prided herself on being practical, grounded in reality. She had moved into this house for one reason: escape. The noise, the crowds, the endless rush of city life, it had worn her thin. A quiet retreat like this, surrounded by nature, felt like the perfect fresh start. Beside her, Jake was already running his hand through the overgrown grass, his eyes alight with excitement. "Can you imagine what we could do with this place?" he said, almost to himself, already dreaming of the renovations, the restoration. "We could turn this into something incredible." Jake had always been the more adventurous one in their relationship, artistic, open-minded, and far more willing to believe in the things most people considered outlandish. Ghost stories, urban legends, the paranormal. Jake had always been intrigued by the mysteries of the world. It was one of the things Emily loved most about him. He brought color into her otherwise black and white world. "Maybe," Emily said, giving a half smile, "but we need to make sure it's not a money pit first." Jake chuckled and slid his arm around her waist. "We'll make it work. Trust. The house has potential, and I think it's waiting for us." Emily smiled and kissed his cheek. "Well, it does have character, that's for sure." They made their way up the overgrown path toward the house, the weight of its silence pressing down on like a thick fog. Even as they crossed the threshold, a subtle unease settled over Emily, but she pushed it aside. The house, like their future here, needed time to breathe. They would fix it up, make it theirs, and in time the oddities would fade. What they didn't know, what neither of them could have possibly guessed, was that the house was far more than just a fixer-upper. It had a history that was buried deep beneath its crumbling walls, a history that no one had dared to uncover. And it wasn't a past that could be easily forgotten. The house had once been home to the Winchesters, a family who had lived there for decades in what seemed like perfect harmony. But that harmony shattered one night when the family mysteriously disappeared. No one had ever discovered what happened to them, and the house had been left empty, its secrets locked away behind doors that had not opened in years. But now, the house was awake, and it had new residents to welcome. The first few days in the house were spent unpacking boxes and making sense of the disarray. Jake was already mapping out plans for the renovations, sketching designs for the rooms and imagining the house in its former glory. He had always been good with his hands, and the idea of restoring this house filled him with a sense of purpose. Emily, however, felt the unease gnaw at her. There was something about the house that she couldn't quite place. It was as if the air itself was thick with an unspoken history, as if the walls had seen too much to ever feel truly peaceful again. She kept the feeling to herself, unsure if it was just the weight of moving to such a quiet, unfamiliar place or if there was something more to it. One afternoon, as Emily explored the attic, looking for old boxes to unpack, she stumbled upon something she hadn't expected to find. The attic was dark and filled with the musty scent of forgotten memories. Dust motes floated in the dim light filtering through the cracked windows, and the floorboards creaked beneath her feet. She was about to turn back when she noticed a leather-bound book tucked away behind a stack of old newspapers. Its edges were worn, its surface cracked with age. Curious, she pulled it from the shadows and blew the dust off its cover. The book was surprisingly heavy, and as she opened it, the faint smell of old paper and ink high. At first, they were faint, just a soft murmur in the back of her mind. She thought she was imagining it, dismissing it as the wind or the creaks of the house settling. But the whispers grew louder each night, becoming more distinct. They were words she couldn't understand, a language she had never heard before. Sometimes she would hear her name soft, distant, calling to her from the darkness. One night, unable to take it any longer, Emily got out of bed and followed the whispers. They seemed to be coming from the attic, the very place where she had found the diary. Her heart raced as she climbed the stairs, her mind swirling with questions. Was it just her imagination? Was the house simply playing tricks on her? She reached the attic, her breath catching in her throat. The air was colder here, the shadows longer. And then she heard it again, the faint whisper of her name. Emily. She spun around, but the attic was empty. The only sound was the wind, howling through the cracks in the walls. The house was watching her, and it wanted something. Emily's unease deepened as she became increasingly convinced that the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. But how could she explain it to Jake? He had always been the one with the open mind, but even he would have a hard time accepting that the house they had fallen in love with was more than they bargained for. As the days passed, Emily noticed Jake's obsession with the house growing. He spent hours in the attic poring over the diary, piecing together the story of the Winchester family further away from him. He was changing, and she wasn't sure if it was the house or something else entirely. The house, it seemed, had a way of making people forget who they were and drawing them into its dark past. This is where the tension begins to rise. The characters are introduced, and the ominous history of the house starts to unravel, creating an eerie atmosphere. As the story progresses, the house's dark influence will continue to grow, setting the stage for the frightening twists and confrontations to come. The night air was thick with the scent of damp wood and the lingering chill of the countryside. Emily and Jake had spent the day moving their belongings into the old house, unpacking boxes with optimism and excitement for their new life on the bustle of city life. The house was grand, its towering stone walls wrapped in ivy, windows large and inviting. It was more than they'd hoped for. A little rough around the edges, perhaps, but full of promise. The house groaned as they entered, the wooden floors creaking beneath their feet. "It's got character," Jake said, running his hand along the banister, his voice full of enthusiasm. "I think it's going to be perfect for us." Emily smiled weakly, glancing up at the narrow staircase that led to the attic. She couldn't shake the feeling that the air around them felt heavier, as though it had absorbed the weight of years of silence and secrets. But she pushed the thought away. They had just moved in, and the house's eerie charm was to be expected after all. It was old, wasn't it? As they prepared for bed that night, the soft wind outside rattled the windows, creating a low, ghostly whistle through the cracks. Emily climbed into the bed, trying to relax. But as she lay there, an unsettling sensation crept over her. A whisper, soft, indistinct, reached her ears. "Did you hear that?" she asked, sitting up in bed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake, already half asleep, mumbled, "It's just the wind, Em. The house is settling. That's all." Emily nodded, trying to shake the feeling off, but as she lay back down, the whispers continued. They were faint, but persistent, almost as if someone or something was speaking just out of reach. She tried to focus on the sound of the wind, but the whispers grew louder for a moment before vanishing entirely. She told herself it was nothing. She had been hearing things. The house was just old. Her thoughts drifted as sleep finally took over, but in the back of her mind, a faint, nagging feeling lingered, one she couldn't quite shake off the next day. They continued unpacking, their laughter echoing in the empty rooms. Jake was more fascinated by the house's quirks, pulling at loose floorboards, marveling at the grand fireplace, and speculating about the history hidden within its walls. Emily was more focused, organizing their belongings and making the space feel like home. It wasn't until she ventured up to the attic, searching for extra blankets, that she stumbled upon something unexpected. Amidst the dust and cobwebs, she found a forgotten trunk, hidden beneath a pile of old furniture. She was initially hesitant to open it. This place had a strange way of evoking unease in her, but curiosity got the better of her. Inside, she found a worn leather-bound diary, its cover cracked with age but still intact. Something about it seemed to draw. They dismissed it as their imaginations running wild, but the occurrences became more frequent. Eleanor's entries were filled with mounting fear, each one more frantic than the last. "Last night, I heard the whispers again," Eleanor wrote in. One entry, but this time they were clear, as if someone was in the room with me. "I woke Henry, but he heard nothing. Am I losing my mind?" Another entry read, "The shadows are getting closer. We see them now, out of the corner of our eyes. My children are afraid to sleep alone. Henry refuses to speak of it, but I know he's heard the whispers too." And then the final entry sent a chill through Emily as she read aloud the last words written in Eleanor's shaky handwriting. "They are coming." A shiver ran down her spine, and she closed the diary with trembling hands. Her mind raced, heart pounding. She couldn't just ignore what she'd read. This was more than just strange happenings. It was fear, real fear, seeping through the words of someone who had lived in this very house. When she found Jake sitting in the living room unpacking some of their books, she held up the diary, her face pale. "Jake, you need to see this." Jake looked up, smiling at her. "What is it?" She handed him the diary, her hands shaking slightly. "It's a diary from the last people who lived here. the Winchesters. There's something really wrong with this house, Jake. I think they were trying to warn us. Jake skimmed through the pages, his brow furrowing. He paused at the last entry, reading it aloud under his breath. They were scared, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. They were terrified of something in the house. I think it's still. Here, Jake closed the diary, shaking his head. It's just a story. Old, crazy stuff. People get spooked easily in big houses like this, especially when they've been abandoned for so long. It's the wind. It's the house settling. But Emily wasn't convinced. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house had secrets. That the Winchesters hadn't been able to escape from. The whispers, the cold drafts, the feeling that something was watching them. It all seemed too real, too connected to the past. Despite Jake's reassurances, Emily's unease grew. Every creak in the house, every shift in the air, made her more aware of how little she understood this place. She couldn't just forget about the diary. It was like a warning, one that was becoming more and more impossible to ignore. As night fell again, and they lay in bed. Emily could still hear the faintest whispers on the wind. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, but the echoes of Eleanor's last words haunted her thoughts. They are coming. It started subtly at first, like a murmur at the edge of her awareness. A soft, unintelligible sound that seemed to come from within the walls. Emily chalked it up to the house settling. Or perhaps her mind playing tricks on her as she adjusted to the isolation of the countryside. But soon the whispers grew louder, more persistent, and began to follow her throughout the day. She was sitting in the kitchen, sorting through boxes, when she heard it again, a low murmur, almost a chant. Her heart skipped a beat, and she looked around, but there was no one there. The house was empty, save for her and Jake. She tried to ignore it, to push it aside, but the whispers seemed to have a presence all their own. They weren't just sound, they felt alive, as if the house itself was trying to communicate, urging her to listen, to understand. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept in, Emily found herself inexplicably drawn to the attic. She couldn't explain it. It was as if something was pulling her, guiding her steps. The air in the attic was cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth downstairs. The shadows were deep and thick in the corners, and the dim light from the single bulb overhead flickered intermittently. As Emily walked into the center of the room, her gaze was drawn to a small, dusty corner, almost hidden behind an old bookshelf. There, half concealed by a pile of forgotten furniture, was a small, weathered wooden box. Her heart raced as she knelt before it, her curiosity overwhelming her caution. The box was locked, the metal clasp tarnished by years of neglect. Without a second thought, she grabbed a rusty nail from the nearby shelf and pried it open. Inside, there were a few objects, a yellowing letter, a tattered scarf, and a handful of photographs. She picked up the first photo, her hands trembling slightly as she dusted off the dirt and debris. The image was black and white, depicting a smiling family man, woman, and children standing together in front of the house. They looked happy, normal, unaware of the darkness that would soon consume them. But as Emily looked closer, something caught her eye. In the background, just beyond the family's smiling faces, was a shadowy figure. A tall, dark shape that seemed almost human, but its form was ined. As the days passed, Emily noticed Jake's growing obsession with the house. What had started as a passionate desire to restore the place to its former glory had morphed into something darker, something all-consuming. He spent hours locked away in the attic, poring over the diaries and photographs, trying to uncover every scrap of history that the house had hidden for so long. Emily tried to remind him of the need for balance, to not lose sight of the present life, but it was as if he couldn't hear her. His focus was entirely on the house, on its history, and on the whispers that seemed to only intensify the deeper. He dug out at night when he would finally come down for dinner. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, his hands trembling with the excitement of his discoveries. He spoke in fits and bursts, telling Emily about strange dreams. He'd had dreams where the shadowy figure from the photographs loomed over him, its cold eyes staring into his soul. In these dreams, the figure would whisper to him, its voice, like gravel scraping against stone, telling him things, secrets that Jake couldn't remember clearly, but that haunted him nonetheless. I can't shake the feeling that it's trying to tell me something, Jake confessed one evening, his voice hoarse as though he hadn't spoken in days. It's like the house is alive, Emily. It's pulling me in and I can't get away from it. It's like I have to finish this or something will happen. Emily tried to reach him, to snap him out of his growing obsession, but each time she mentioned taking a break or doing something together, Jake would only grow more distant. It was as if his mind had already left her, his body remaining behind, only because it had nowhere else to go. The whispers, once faint and distant, had now become a constant presence, swirling around the house like a malevolent wind. At night, they seemed to be louder in Jake's presence, always just beyond hearing, always just outside the corner of his vision. He spoke of dark figures that watched him from the edges of his sight, figures that never fully materialized but were always there, lurking in the shadows. One night, Emily found him in the attic, his face pale and drawn, staring blankly at the wall. When she approached him, he didn't even react. It was as if he hadn't heard her, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. "It wants us," he murmured, his voice a low, hollow whisper. "It wants us to stay." The change in Jake was not the only thing that unsettled Emily. One evening, as she was cleaning the hallway, she felt an icy chill sweep over her. She froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The house was silent, too silent, except for a faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound coming from the other side of the hall dot as she stepped forward. Her heart pounding, she saw it. A figure, pale, translucent, was standing at the far end of the hallway, its back to her. The woman was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, her hair dark and wild, her face gaunt and hollow. Her eyes, dark and sunken, locked onto Emily with an intensity that froze her in place. The woman's lips parted, and though no sound came out, Emily could feel the scream, or whatever it was, reverberating in the air. Cold and heavy, Emily stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to run to escape, but her legs felt like lead, her body frozen by a terror that went beyond fear. The figure's eyes seemed to reach for her, pulling her in, and then just as suddenly as it had appeared, vanished, leaving only the smell of decay and the echo of that silent scream. Emily rushed to find Jake, but when she reached the attic, He wasn't there. The whispers were louder than ever, swarming around her like an oppressive fog, and she realized, with growing horror, that she couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore. Were they in her head, or were they coming from the house itself? She found Jake, hours later, standing motionless in front of a dusty old mirror in the basement. His reflection was distorted, his eyes wide, his face pale, but it wasn't his own reflection she saw. There, behind him in the mirror, stood the shadowy figure from the photographs. Its form was clear now, solid, and it seemed to be watching them both. Jake didn't move. His eyes never left the mirror. "It's trying to pull us in, Emily," he whispered. "It's trying to take us." Emily reached out, but the words died on her lips. She could feel the house closing in around them, its presence suffocating. The walls, the floor, the very air they breathed felt as if it was alive. And the echoes of the past were more than just memories. They were real, and they were coming for them. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred. And now, there was no way to escape Dot in this act. The horror intensifies as the house's power over Jake and Emily grows. The manifestations become clearer, more terrifying, and Emily finds herself trapped in a reality that's slipping further. Grown pale, his eyes hollow, she realized that the house had already begun to claim him, using his obsession with the past as its tool to draw him further into its grip. The whispers that had tormented her, the strange feelings of being watched, the coldness that seemed to seep into her bones. They weren't just figments of her imagination. They were part of the house's malevolent influence, feeding on her and Jake, using their emotions to tether them to the land, to the past, and to the entity that lurked within. Emily's mind raced as the full horror of the situation settled in. They weren't just in danger, they were being consumed by the house. And if they didn't escape soon, they would be lost, just like the Winchesters. Desperation fueled Emily's steps as she climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The house seemed to grow darker with each passing moment, the air heavier, more oppressive. She could feel the pulse of the house, its malignant energy pressing against her chest. But she refused to be paralyzed by fear. She had to save Jake, or they would both be lost. She found him sitting in the same spot where he had been for days, his eyes vacant, his face a ghostly mask. He didn't even seem to acknowledge her presence as she approached. "Jake, Emily," sad, her voice strained with urgency. "Jake, please listen to me." He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a strange emptiness. "You don't understand, Emily," he said in a voice that was no longer his own. "The house ... it's been waiting for us. It wants us. We can't leave. If we leave, we'll die, just like the Winchesters. The house will never let us go." A chill ran down Emily's spine, but she stood her ground. "Jake, no, this isn't you. It's the house. You have to fight it." He shook his head slowly, a faint, bitter smile curling his lips. "I can't. The house. It speaks to me. It shows me things. It tells me that we are part of its cycle now. You can't stop it, Emily." Her heart broke as she realized just how deep the house had sunk its claws into him. She had to do something. Anything. Then. She remembered the diary. She grabbed it from the dusty floor, flipping through the pages until she reached the final entry. She read the words aloud, each one a lifeline, a desperate plea for escape. We will not let them take us. We will escape. The words echoed through the room, reverberating against the walls, and for a moment, Jake's expression faltered. His vacant eyes seemed to regain a flicker of recognition. Escape? He whispered, his voice trembling. Emily rushed to him, grabbing his hand with all the strength she could muster. Jake, you can fight this. We can escape. We have to. For us. For the first time in days, Jake's eyes seemed to focus on her, and a look of confusion mixed with terror crossed his face. He blinked several times, as if waking from a deep sleep. I don't know how. To leave ... He whispered, his voice breaking. The house won't let me. Emily pulled him to his feet, refusing to let go. It can't keep us. It's trying to break us, Jake, but we have the power to leave. Together, as they stood there, the house around them groaned, the walls seeming to shudder with anger. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that threatened to overwhelm them. But Emily didn't falter. She wouldn't, not now. The house seemed to fight them at every turn. As they made their way through the hallways, doors slammed shut in their faces, blocking their path. The air grew thick with fog, and the temperature dropped, turning the house into an icy tomb. Emily's breath came out in visible puffs as she pulled Jake toward the front door. Come on, she shouted, her voice hoarse with panic. We're almost there. But just as they reached the front door, the house screamed, a deafening roar that shook the very foundation. The windows rattled violently, and the doors slammed shut, trapping them inside once again. No. Emily screamed, her hands pressing against the door. She could feel the house's power pushing back, trying to pull them back into its clutches. The ground beneath their feet trembled, as if the house was alive, fighting for its next victim. Emily refused to give up. She grabbed Jake's hand tighter, pulling him with her as they ran toward the back door. It was their last chance. The fog swirled around them, thick and impenetrable, but Emily didn't stop. She couldn't. The house was roaring behind them, its fury manifesting in violent tremors that rattled the ground beneath their feet. She could hear the walls groaning as if they were alive, desperate to hold on to them, to consume them. Just as they reached the gate, Emily turned back one last time. The house was now just a silhouette in the fog, but she could feel its rage, its hunger. Reaching out for them, and then with a final deafening scream, the fog parted. They were free. Days later, Emily and Jake were miles away from the house, living in a small town where the air felt clean and the skies weak.